The dust on the highway seemed to hum a sleepy tune as the black Cadillac rolled into Tupelo Creek. Elvis Presley, or rather, the man who was currently just Mr. Thompson to anyone who bothered to ask, breathed a sigh of relief. He hadn't really picked this town. It had just appeared. A flicker of faded sign, a stretch of road that felt forgotten by time. That was precisely what he needed. Life had become a relentless, roaring current. Every step, every glance, every whispered word was amplified, scrutinized, turned into something bigger than it was. He loved his fans. Truly he did. But even the king of rock and roll needed a quiet harbor, a place where the echo of applause faded and the only sound was the rustle of leaves. He'd left his entourage back in Nashville, telling them he needed a few days to clear his head, to write, to just be. He'd chosen this beat-up Cadillac, a relic from his early days, instead of the gleaming newer models, hoping its subtle charm would help him blend in. Tupelo Creek felt like stepping back in time. The main street was barely a block long, lined with brick buildings that looked like they'd been standing since the invention of the telephone. A barber pole spun lazily, a diner promised home cooking. And right in the middle, catching his eye, was a general store. Its faded sign read, Silas's Emporium, Est. 1932. Paint was peeling. The windows were a bit grimy, and one of the two porch columns leaned precariously. But something about it called to him. It looked utterly, gloriously. He parked the car a little way down the street beneath the shade of an old oak tree, and just sat for a moment. The air was warm, smelling of summer and dust, and something vaguely like fresh-cut grass. A dog barked in the distance. A lone sparrow flitted onto the hood of his car, eyed him, and then flew off. This was it. This was the kind of normal he craved. He got out of the car, pulling the brim of his fedora down low. He was dressed simply today. A plain button-down shirt, dark trousers, and sunglasses. He hoped the disguise, combined with the town's general disinterest in anything beyond its own borders, would be enough. He just wanted to buy a soda, maybe a local newspaper, and perhaps a small, insignificant trinket to remember this moment of peace by. He wanted to feel like a regular person just once. As he walked towards Silas's Emporium, the wooden sidewalk creaked under his weight. The scent of aged wood and something vaguely medicinal, like old cough drops, grew stronger as he approached the entrance. The screen door, patched in one corner, whined softly as he pushed it open. A tiny bell jingled somewhere inside, its sound thin and forlorn. The interior of Silas's Emporium was a treasure trove of forgotten times. Shelves stretched to the high ceiling, crammed with an eclectic mix of goods. Fishing lures, next to spools of thread, dusty tins of tea beside rows of nails. A whole section dedicated to various types of seeds. The air was still and cool, carrying the scent of wood and the faint metallic tang of old tools. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the grimy windows, illuminating the quiet chaos. He strolled slowly down an aisle, running a finger along a row of old glass bottles, marveling at the sheer volume of stuff packed into such a small space. It wasn't like any store he'd ever been in before. Certainly not the gleaming department stores or the bustling pharmacies of Memphis or Los Angeles. This was real. This felt like the past preserved. He spotted a cooler in the back. An old Coca-Cola cooler. The kind with a built-in bottle opener on the side. Just the sight of it made him smile. He imagined a cold, classic soda, the fizz bursting on his tongue. That's what he wanted. A simple, perfectly ordinary soda. He approached the counter, ready for a normal transaction. Ready to just be another face in a quiet town. He felt a rare, profound sense of peace. The counter at Silas's Emporium was made of dark, scarred wood, worn smooth in places by countless transactions. Behind it, a man sat on a stool, hunched over a ledger, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He was an older gentleman, perhaps in his late 60s or early 70s, with a shock of thinning white hair and a face etched with 1,000 lines like a map of countless worries. His apron, once white, was now a permanent shade of beige, stained with the marks of honest labor and perhaps a few forgotten spills. Elvis cleared his throat gently. The man didn't look up. He continued to scrawl figures in his book, the tip of his pencil scratching loudly in the otherwise silent store. "Excuse me," Elvis tried again, his voice soft, almost a murmur, hoping not to startle him. The man finally lifted his head slowly as if the effort pained him. His eyes, a pale blue, were sharp and suspicious, darting over Elvis's face, taking in the fedora, the sunglasses, the simple but well-made clothes. A flicker of disdain, or perhaps just weariness, crossed his features. "What do you want?" the man grunted, his voice like gravel scraping against stone. It wasn't a question, but a challenge. There was no warmth, no welcome in it. Elvis, despite his usual charm and ability to win over any crowd, felt a flicker of surprise. He was used to smiles, to recognition, to immediate, overwhelming attention. This was new, and not in a good way. "Good afternoon," Elvis began, attempting to inject some politeness into the rigid air. "I was wondering if I could get a soda from your cooler." The man didn't move. He just stared at Elvis, his gaze unwavering, cold. "We ain't got no sodas," he said, his voice flat. "And we ain't got no newspapers for your type." Elvis blinked behind his sunglasses. His type. What did that mean? He looked towards the old Coca-Cola cooler, clearly visible from where he stood. It was there he could see it. "Pardon me," Elvis said, genuinely confused. "I believe I saw a cooler in the back. A Coca-Cola cooler, actually." The old man finally slid off his stool, moving with a stiffness that suggested old aches and pains. He walked around the counter, his eyes still fixed on Elvis, like a wary badger. He was shorter than Elvis and wiry, but he carried himself with a stubborn rigidity. "I said, we ain't got none," he repeated, his voice rising slightly tinged with an edge of irritation. "And even if we did, I wouldn't sell it to you." He gestured vaguely at Elvis's clothes, his fedora, his general aura of being from somewhere else. "We don't serve your kind in here. Too flashy, too much trouble. You ain't from around here, are you?" Elvis felt a flush rise to his cheeks. Elvis Presley, being refused service for being too flashy. He had arrived in the most understated way he could manage, seeking anonymity. This was almost comical. For a moment, his usual quick wit, his ready smile failed him. He stood there, speechless, the simple desire for a soda suddenly feeling like an impossible monumental task. He could feel the familiar spark of irritation, the ego that usually flared when he was challenged. He could demand, he could reveal who he was, he could cause a scene, he could make the man regret those words. But then, as he looked at the old man, really looked at him, the deep lines around his eyes, the set of his jaw, the almost palpable weariness that seemed to cling to him like dust, something shifted inside Elvis. The irritation faded, replaced by a different kind of curiosity. This wasn't anger. This wasn't a challenge to his fame. This was something else entirely. This wasn't about him at all. This was about the man in front of him, this Silas, and whatever dark cloud seemed to hang over him. Instead of arguing, instead of demanding, Elvis slowly, quietly, took a step back. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even drop his sunglasses. He just stood there, taking a long, deliberate look around the quiet, dusty store. He saw the peeling paint on the walls, the dim lighting, the thick layer of dust on the shelves. He saw the old man standing there, defiant and bitter. A different kind of reaction, one that had nothing to do with fame or anger, began to stir in Elvis's heart. A priceless reaction. He felt a sudden, unexpected urge to understand. Elvis didn't believe, not right away anyway. The old man Silas seemed to expect him to storm out, perhaps to mutter curses under his breath, or slam the screen door on his way out. But Elvis just stood there, his gaze no longer fixed on the grumpy proprietor, but drifting around the store he saw the silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet he had sought, but a heavy, almost suffocating silence, the kind that settles in when a place has been devoid of joy for too long. He noticed the cobwebs in the corners of the ceiling, the way some of the merchandise seemed to be covered in an undisturbed layer of fine dust, as if untouched for years. It wasn't just a cluttered store, it was a neglected one. His eyes scanned the counter area again. Beyond the ledger, nestled among a jumble of old pens and a rusty cash register, he spotted a small tarnished silver frame. Inside, a faded photograph yellowed with age. It showed a younger Silas, his face less hardened, even a hint of a smile on his lips. Standing beside him was a woman, her arm linked through his, her eyes bright with a gentle warmth. And between them, a little girl, no older than 5 or 6, with bright pigtails and a gap-toothed grin, holding a small, wilting wildflower. The image hit Elvis with a quiet force. It was a picture of happiness, of a family, of a life lived, and it stood in stark contrast to the grim, solitary man now glaring at him from behind the counter. A wave of empathy, strong and sudden, washed over Elvis. He knew about loss. He knew about the hollow ache of absence. He knew how it could twist a person, turn them inward, build walls around their heart. Silas, still waiting for him to leave, shifted uncomfortably under Elvis's prolonged, unreadable gaze. "Are you deaf, boy?" I said. "We ain't got nothing for you." Elvis finally met his eyes, his own, hidden behind the dark lenses. "I heard you," he said, his voice surprisingly calm, almost gentle. "I was just looking around. This is quite a place you have here," Silas scoffed, clearly not believing the compliment. "It's a store people come in. They buy things, or they don't." His eyes flickered to the photo frame, then away quickly as if burned. Elvis noticed the flicker. He noticed the way Silas's shoulders seemed to slump a little, the almost imperceptible tremor in his hand as he picked up his pencil again, feigning disinterest. He wasn't just grumpy, he was broken. His grumpiness was a shield, a thick, dusty curtain drawn over a deep wound. Beyond the counter, Elvis noticed a section of the wooden floorboards looked darker than the rest, almost perpetually damp. He could hear a faint, irregular drip sound, a leaky pipe perhaps. A small, persistent problem that, if ignored, could lead to bigger ones. He also saw a loose shutter outside the main window, swaying slightly in the breeze that crept through the open door, rattling against the glass. Minor things, easily fixed, but indicative of a larger neglect. He thought about the vibrant, bustling life he usually led, the endless demands, the constant need to be on, to perform, to entertain. He was a king, yes, but he was also a man who sometimes felt profoundly alone, understood by very few. In this quiet, dusty store, facing this unexpectedly bitter man, he found an odd sense of connection. This wasn't a challenge to his fame. This was a human being, hurting, putting up a wall. And for the first time in a long time, Elvis felt a purpose that had nothing to do with music or applause. It was a simple, deeply human purpose. He didn't want a soda anymore. Not really. He wanted to understand this man. He wanted to help him. His priceless reaction, he realized, wasn't a burst of anger or a display of celebrity. Power. It was quiet resolve. Silas just grunted again, not looking up from his ledger. He seemed relieved. Elvis pushed open the screen door. The little bell jingled, and the warm afternoon air enveloped him. He walked out, not with a huff of indignation, but with a quiet, thoughtful expression. On his face, he knew he'd be back. He wasn't sure how or when or what he would do, but he knew he wouldn't let this old man fester in his self-imposed darkness. He had found a new project, a different kind of performance, one that mattered more than any stage show. The next morning, Elvis was back in Tupelo Creek. He parked his car down a side street out of immediate sight of Silas's Emporium and walked. He had changed into even more unassuming clothes, a simple work shirt, jeans, and sturdy boots. He wore a baseball cap, pulled low, and left his sunglasses in the car, hoping to appear less like a famous musician and more like just another local passing through. He strolled past Silas's store, pretending to be heading somewhere else, just observing. The loose shutter he'd noticed yesterday was still there, banging faintly in the gentle morning breeze. As he passed, he saw an elderly woman, Mrs. Gable, whom he'd briefly seen yesterday, struggling to tie a bunch of flowers to the community bulletin board outside the general store. She was short, and the board was just a little too high for her. Elvis hesitated for a split second, then acted. He walked over, gave her a polite nod. "Need a hand with that, ma'am?" he asked. His voice low and friendly. Mrs. Gable, a kindly woman with bright, curious eyes, smiled up at him. "Oh, would you, dear? This old back ain't what it used to be." He easily reached up, securing the bundle of wildflowers firmly to the board. "There you go," he said. "Why, thank you, young man," she chirped. "You're new around here, aren't you?" "Haven't seen you in Tupelo Creek before." "Just passing through," Elvis replied with a practiced smile. "Enjoying the quiet," she nodded. "It is quiet, mostly. Well, bless your heart for the help." She glanced toward Silas's store. "You mind that old curmudgeon in there? Though Silas ain't got a kind word for nobody these days." Elvis simply nodded, then continued his stroll, acting as if he was just taking a walk around the block. But as he rounded the corner out of Mrs. Gable's sight, he circled back, approaching the general store from the alley. The loose shutter was right there, just above the side window. He found a loose brick on the ground tucked into the weeds. He carefully propped it against the wall and climbed onto it, reaching for the shutter. It was an easy fix. A couple of the screws holding it were loose almost entirely out. He found a small rusty screwdriver in his pocket. He often carried one for odd spur-of-the-moment adjustments to his guitars or equipment, and quickly tightened them. The shutter, once rattling, now sat firmly against the wall. He jumped down, brushed the dust from his hands, and walked away unnoticed. Or so he hoped. Later that afternoon, Elvis found himself sitting on a bench across the street, pretending to read a newspaper he'd bought from the diner, but really just watching the store. He saw Mrs. Gable approach Silas's door. She paused, looked up at the shutter, and then looked towards the bulletin board. A small smile touched her lips. Silas, who was peering out the window with his usual scowl, probably noticed her reaction, even if he didn't know why. Probably just dismissed it as Mrs. Gable being her usual cheerful self. Elvis decided to try again. He crossed the street, pushed open the screen door, and entered the store. The little bell jingled, announcing his presence. Silas behind the counter looked up, his eyes narrowing even more than yesterday. "You?" Again Silas grunted, his voice devoid of surprise, only annoyance. "I told you we ain't got nothing for you." "Good afternoon, Mr. Silas," Elvis said, ignoring the man's hostility. He walked towards an aisle filled with dusty old tools. "I was just admiring your collection here. Some real classic pieces. You don't see craftsmanship like this anymore." Picked up an old tarnished handplane, tracing its smooth, worn wood. Silas snorted. "Just old junk. Nobody buys it?" "Well, I beg to differ," Elvis said. "There's a beauty in things that have lasted, wouldn't you say? Things that have a story?" He looked at Silas, a genuine question in his eyes. "This place, for example, it must have seen a lot of stories, a lot of life." Silas just glared at him. "It's a store, nothing more. Now are you going to buy something, or are you just here to waste my time?" Elvis put the handplane back carefully. "I'd love to buy something, Mr. Silas, but you said you wouldn't sell to my kind." He let the words hang in the air, a quiet reminder of the previous day's refusal. Silas bristled. "And I meant it. I don't want your money." "Now get out," didn't flinch. He just nodded, stirs Silas. "Have a good day," turned and walked towards the door, the small bell jingling behind him as he left. He walked away, a plan beginning to form. He couldn't just offer money or openly help. Silas would reject it, seeing it as charity or worse, an insult. He had to be subtle. He had to find a way to help Silas without Silas even realizing he was being helped. This was going to be a long game. But Elvis was a patient man when he truly believed in something. And he believed there was a good man hidden somewhere beneath Silas's gruff exterior. He just needed to find the key. Days turned into a quiet week. Elvis settled into a routine in Tupelo Creek. He rented a small, unassuming cabin on the outskirts of town, telling the landlady he was a writer, seeking inspiration. He spent his mornings walking, observing, and his afternoons subtly weaving himself into the fabric of the community. All while keeping a watchful eye on Silas's Emporium, he continued his small, unnoticed acts of kindness. He'd see an elderly person struggling with groceries and offer to carry them. He'd pick up litter on the sidewalk near the store. He'd even sweep the front porch of a neighbor's house when he saw them struggling. He didn't introduce himself as anything other than Mr. Thompson, a polite, quiet stranger. The townspeople, initially wary, began to warm to him. Mrs. Gable, the kind baker, started waving to him when he passed her shop. The young boy, who delivered newspapers, Billy, would nod at him respectfully. People started, including him in casual conversations, talking about the weather, local gossip, the slow pace of life in Tupelo Creek. One afternoon, sitting on the bench across from Silas's, Billy approached him. "Hey, Mr. Thompson," he said, adjusting the strap of his newspaper bag. "Why do you keep going into old Silas's store? He's a real grouch, ain't he?" Elvis smiled. "He can be a bit direct," he admitted. "But I think there's more to him than meets the eye," Billy scoffed. "My daddy says he's just mean. Nobody goes in there anymore. Not unless they absolutely have to. His store's dying. Everyone knows it." "Maybe," Elvis said thoughtfully, his gaze fixed on the quiet, shadowed interior of the general store. "Or maybe it just needs a little bit of tending," Billy shrugged, clearly not understanding. "Well, good luck. With that, he wouldn't even sell my grandma a new light bulb last week, told her he was out, and I saw a whole box of them in the back room." Elvis felt a surge of confirmation. Silas's grumpiness wasn't just about his type. It was a blanket of misery he seemed to spread over everyone and everything. But what? Silas himself was definitely noticing Elvis's persistent presence. He never served him still glared daggers when Elvis entered, but the irritation seemed to be mingling with a faint, almost imperceptible trace of confusion. He'd catch Elvis watching the store from across the street or walking by, and his brow would furrow. He couldn't figure this man out. Most people, once rebuffed by Silas, never came back. This man, Mr. Thompson, was different. He was like a quiet shadow, always there, never demanding, just existing. One day, Elvis saw a small delivery truck pull up to Silas's store, bringing a few boxes of what looked like cleaning supplies. The driver, a young man, struggled to lift a particularly heavy box onto the porch. Silas, standing just inside the doorway, merely watched, his arms crossed, making no move to help. Elvis, who happened to be walking by, casually stepped in. "Need a hand with that, son?" he asked the driver, who looked exhausted. "Yes, sir, much obliged." The driver gasped, clearly relieved. Elvis effortlessly lifted the heavy box, his years of physical training and stage work making it seem light. He carried it onto the porch and set it down gently. "Thanks, mister," the driver said, wiping his brow. "Anytime," Elvis replied, giving a quick, polite nod to Silas, who was still standing in the doorway, eyes wide, watching the scene unfold. Silas didn't say anything, but Elvis saw something in his eyes, a flicker of surprise, a moment of uncharacteristic stillness. He expected a dismissive grunt or a demand to leave, but Silas just stared. He didn't even slam the door when Elvis walked away. It was a tiny crack in the gruff exterior, barely visible, but Elvis saw it. That evening, Elvis overheard some gossip at the diner. Mrs. Gable was talking to the owner, Martha. "That new fellow, Mr. Thompson, he's a real gentleman, helped Billy fix his bicycle chain this morning, and then helped that delivery boy with Silas's order. Silas just stood there, watching him, like a cat on a hot tin roof. Martha, nobody's ever done a kindness. Not without getting a sour look anyway. Maybe this Mr. Thompson will be the one to finally crack that nut." Elvis, sipping his coffee, felt a quiet satisfaction. The ripples were spreading. Silas was noticing even if he didn't understand. The groundwork was being laid. He knew the old man wouldn't change overnight, but he felt a shift in the air. The unspoken animosity that had been so thick on his first visit was thinning, replaced by a strange, bewildered curiosity on Silas's part. It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't outright hostility either. It was progress. The more, Elvis observed Silas, the more convinced he became that the man's grumpiness was a symptom, not the root cause. It was too deep, too pervasive. He needed to understand the story behind the old man's pain. He decided to turn his subtle observation into subtle inquiry. One sunny afternoon, Elvis was helping Mrs. Gable arrange her flower display outside her bakery. She was humming a gospel tune, her movements slow but deliberate. "Mrs. Gable," Elvis began casually, "I've been wondering about Silas. He seems like a man with a lot on his mind." Mrs. Gable sighed. Her humming. She picked up a wilting rose and gently plucked off the dead petals. "Silas," she repeated, her voice softer, tinged with sadness. "He wasn't always like this, you know. He used to be, well, not joyful, but certainly not this bitter. He used to laugh sometimes, even smiled a time or two." Elvis waited patiently. "It was about 15 years ago," she continued, her gaze distant, fixed on something unseen. "There was an accident, a car accident just outside of town. Terrible thing. Took his wife Eleanor and their little girl Clara." Elvis felt a chill run down his spine. Despite the warm sun, his own twin brother Jesse, gone so young, he knew that kind of hollow ache. "Clara," Mrs. Gable murmured. "She was a bright spark, that one, full of life, always drawing pictures for Silas, leaving little wildflowers on his counter. Silas adored them both. The store, this whole place. It was their dream. He never tried to move on." Elvis asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Gable asked, her eyes welling up slightly. "He had nothing else. No other family, no real friends outside of Eleanor. Just the store. And now, even that's failing. He refuses to modernize, refuses to sell anything new. Just sits there, day in and day out, watching the dust settle, just like the dust settled on his life." She looked at Elvis, her eyes filled with a weary understanding. "He keeps it open because it's the only thing left of them. He refuses to let it live. It's a sad thing to watch, Mr. Thompson, a very sad thing." Elvis thanked her, his heart heavy. He now understood. He wasn't rejecting Elvis because of who he thought Elvis was. He was rejecting the world. Rejecting any potential happiness because it had taken everything from him once before. The small wilting wildflower in the faded photograph now made painful sense. This knowledge deepened Elvis's resolve tenfold. This wasn't just about a simple soda anymore. It was about redemption. It was about reminding Silas that life, even after profound loss, could still offer something. It was about showing him that even a neglected monument could be cleaned, restored, and filled with new life. He walked back towards the Emporium, no longer just a curious stranger, but a man on a mission. He saw the peeling paint, the dim light inside the leaning porch post, not as signs of neglect, but as cries for help. Silas wasn't just a grumpy store owner, he was a silent testament to a tragedy. Elvis realized that, whatever he did, it couldn't be about just fixing the store. It had to be about fixing the man. It had to be about honoring Eleanor and Clara, not by letting the store decay, but by bringing it back to life, by letting it once again be a place of warmth and community. This was a challenge far greater than any concert hall, any record sale. This was about reaching a soul that had seemingly given up. And Elvis, with his own history of struggle and his deep well of empathy, felt uniquely qualified for the task. He would find a way. He would help Silas. He would bring light back to Silas's Emporium and hopefully to Silas's heart. Armed with his newfound understanding of Silas's past, Elvis began to put his plan into motion. He knew a direct approach was useless. Silas would only retreat further into his shell. He had to be like a gentle current, slowly eroding the walls. Without the old man even realizing it, he started with the most obvious needs of the store. The leaning porch post bothered him. It was structurally unsound and just plain sad. Elvis quietly contacted a construction company in a nearby larger town, far enough away that they wouldn't recognize him nor care about the specifics of the job beyond getting paid. He explained he wanted some anonymous repairs done at Silas's Emporium in Tupelo Creek. He made it clear that the owner was a proud man and preferred to believe the work was somehow arranged or mistakenly delivered. He offered a generous sum enough to make the company agree without too many questions. A few days later, a small, unmarked truck pulled up to Silas's store early in the morning. Before Silas even opened, two quiet, efficient workers unloaded a sturdy new porch post, some fresh lumber, and a few cans of paint. They worked quickly, replacing the old, wobbly post with a strong new one, and subtly reinforcing the porch. They even gave the front of the store a quick, fresh coat of matching cream paint, blending it bossing with the old without making it obvious. They finished and were gone before Silas arrived to open his store. When Silas opened up, he stopped dead in his tracks. The porch post was solid. The paint on the front of his store looked fresher. He squinted, touched the new wood, then the newly painted section. He frowned, confused. Had he just not noticed it before? No, that was impossible. He knew every crack and crevice of his store. He walked outside, looked around expecting to see someone. He shook his head, muttering about ghosts and shenanigans, but he couldn't deny the change. Next, Elvis tackled the leaky pipe. He'd observed Silas, enough to know when he took his mid-morning break for a cup of lukewarm coffee. During one such break, Elvis slipped into the store through the back alley, carrying a small tsuko. Quickly found the source of the persistent drip, a corroded joint under the counter. Quick wrench and a new fitting, a simple repair for anyone with basic plumbing knowledge, and the leak was gone. He cleaned up a small puddle and left as silently as he'd arrived, leaving the old corroded fitting in a small discreet pile of trash outside the alley door, for Silas to find if he ever looked closely. Silas noticed her eye. His frown deepened, morphing from confusion to a grudging bewilderment. Who? Why, it was like the store was fixing itself. Elvis then turned his attention to the interior. He knew Silas wouldn't buy new stock, but the old stock was often just in disarray. He started arriving at the store earlier, just as Silas was opening, pretending to be admiring the sunrise over Tupelo Creek. While Silas was distracted with his morning rituals, Elvis would quickly, straighten a few shelves, dust a forgotten display, or arrange items in a more appealing way. He made sure never to move anything Silas considered sacred, just making things neat, accessible. Silas would walk through his store and suddenly find a shelf of fishing lures neatly organized or a pile of dusty fabric bolts tidily stacked. He'd pause, rub his chin, and look around suspiciously. He knew he hadn't done it. Yet the store was subtly improving, becoming less chaotic, less dim. It was unsettling, but also Elvis noted Silas's scowl seemed to soften, if only for a fleeting moment when he saw the order. The air in the store felt a little lighter. The electrical wiring was old, the bulbs weak. Elvis again contacted an electrical supply company, arranging for a special bulk order of brighter, more energy-efficient light bulbs to be delivered to Silas, along with an anonymous, heavily discounted invoice that looked like a mistake. The delivery driver simply dropped off the boxes, said, "Here's your order, Silas," and drove off before Silas could argue. Silas stared at the boxes of new light bulbs. He hesitated, then grudgingly began replacing the old dim ones. As each new bulb flickered to life, the store gradually became brighter, cleaner looking. The dust, though still present, seemed less overwhelming in the new light. The old man, for the first time in years, was actively improving his store. Even if he didn't know why or how these supplies were appearing, Elvis watched it all. A quiet smile on his face. He wasn't just fixing a store. He was helping Silas take the first tentative steps towards reclaiming a little piece of his life, and Silas, despite his continued grumbles, was doing it. The anonymous helping hand was working its magic. The subtle improvements to Silas's Emporium didn't go unnoticed by the townspeople. The porch looked sturdier. The front of the store a touch brighter. People walking by would pause, squint, and then exchange puzzled glances. Gossip, the lifeblood of Tupelo Creek, began to hum around this strange transformation. Elvis knew repairs weren't enough. The store needed customers. A pulse but direct encouragement would seem suspicious. He needed a catalyst, something that would naturally draw people to the store. He struck up a conversation with Martha, the diner owner, one afternoon. "Martha," he began, "I've been thinking Tupelo Creek has such a rich history. All those old buildings like Silas's Emporium. They're like living museums. It's a shame more people don't appreciate them." Martha nodded. "True enough, our history's fading, just like Silas's store." What if, Elvis mused, we did something to celebrate that history? A Tupelo Creek Heritage Day. Maybe a small craft fair, some local music, people sharing old stories, and we could highlight some of the historic businesses, perhaps even offer a little tour, like a scavenger hunt, encouraging people to visit them. A Heritage Day. Why, that's a wonderful idea, Mr. Thompson. We haven't had a proper town event in years. Over the next few days, Elvis, with Martha's enthusiastic help, helped organize the event. He stayed in the background, offering suggestions but letting the townspeople take ownership. He subtly suggested that Silas's Emporium, being the oldest store, should be a central part of the Heritage Tour. He even managed to get the town's small volunteer band to agree to play some old-time country tunes right outside Silas's store. He also found a way to inject some cash into Silas's struggling business without it seeming like charity. Elvis had always been fascinated by unique old items. He returned to Silas's store, ostensibly looking for collectibles. He spent a good hour browsing the dusty shelves, picking out a few truly old, interesting pieces. A vintage tin sign, a beautifully crafted but tarnished old compass, a set of antique postcards depicting Tupelo Creek. Silas watched him with narrowed eyes as Elvis brought the items to the counter. "You actually want these old things," he grumbled, though there was a hint of surprise in his voice. "Absolutely," Elvis said with genuine enthusiasm. "They're treasures. I'm starting a collection of Tupelo Creek memorabilia. These are perfect." He paid a fair price, perhaps a little more than they were worth, but not so much that Silas would be suspicious. The old man counted the money slowly, a rare, almost unreadable expression on his face. The extra cash, Elvis hoped, would help with some of the store's more pressing, expensive needs. As Heritage Day approached, the town buzzed with excitement. Banners went up, flyers were distributed. The idea of a scavenger hunt that led people to Silas's store was a hit. People started talking about the old Silases, recalling it from their childhoods or hearing stories from their parents. On the day of the event, Tupelo Creek came alive, Faffery echoing. The volunteer band played outside Silas's, their cheerful music a stark contrast to the store's usual silence. People, guided by the scavenger hunt, hesitantly approached Silas's Emporium. Silas, standing behind his counter, looked overwhelmed. Customers, real customers, were actually entering his store. They weren't just curious, they were buying. Small things. At first, a pack of nails, a spool of string, a forgotten candy bar from a dusty jar. The cash register, which usually only saw a few transactions a day, was ringing with surprising regularity. He was still gruff. "What do you want?" He'd bark, but his eyes darted nervously, almost shyly around the room. He didn't quite know how to handle this influx. He was serving people, yes, but almost in a daze. The store, once a lonely tomb, was filled with the murmur of voices, the shuffling of feet, the occasional burst of laughter. Elvis watched from a distance, hidden by the small crowd. He saw Mrs. Gable buy a small ancient sewing kit from Silas. He saw young Billy proudly show his dad a strange old key he'd bought from the counter. The town was rediscovering Silas's Emporium. And Silas, though still guarded, was clearly affected by it. His shoulders seemed a little less hunched. His movements, though still stiff, had a hint of purpose. He was still a curmudgeon. But the fortress was showing signs of cracking, not just from the outside in, but from the inside out. The success of Heritage Day had a profound impact on Silas's Emporium, and on Silas himself. The initial surge of customers slowed down, but a steady trickle remained. People had remembered the old store, remembered the unique items it held, and more importantly, remembered that Silas, despite his grumbles, was still there. One sunny Tuesday morning, a large professional painting crew arrived at Silas's Emporium. They had new ladders, drop cloths, and dozens of cans of high quality. Paint in shades of cream and forest green. They began to meticulously repaint the entire exterior of the building, including the detailed trim, the front door, and even a fresh, vibrant coat for the old Silas's Emporium sign, bringing the faded letters back to life. Silas, who had just stepped out onto his porch with his morning coffee, froze. He stared at the crew, then at the fresh paint already covering parts of his store. This wasn't a small, anonymous fix. This was a full-blown renovation, unmistakable and undeniable. "What in tarnation are you doing?" Silas bellowed, his voice raw with a mixture of shock and anger. "Who told you to do this?" One of the painters, a young man with paint splatters on his overalls, looked down from his ladder. "Morning, sir. Just doing the job. All paid for. Instructions were to make sure it was a surprise and to make it look like new, but still old." He grinned. "Quite a character, this client of yours." Silas marched towards him, his eyes blazing. "Client? I ain't got no client. This is my store." "Who paid you?" The painter just shrugged. "Can't say, sir. Orders are orders. Anonymous. But they said you'd be pleased once it's done." Silas stood there fuming, but also utterly bewildered. He watched as the painters worked with professional efficiency, transforming his neglected store right before his eyes. The new paint made the old bricks pop. The windows, cleaned by the crew, sparkled. And the freshly painted sign seemed to glow. It looked like the store from the old photograph, vibrant and alive. Later that afternoon, after the painters had packed up and left, leaving behind a pristine, gleaming exterior, Silas found Elvis sitting on the bench across the street, as he often did, seemingly enjoying the quiet. His movements were different now, less angry, more measured, almost heavy with a newfound emotion. He stopped a few feet from Elvis, his hands, calloused and worn, hanging loosely at his sides. "It was you, wasn't it?" Silas's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. He didn't sound angry anymore, just lost. Post, the pipes, the light bulbs, the town party, and now this. He gestured vaguely at the freshly painted store, which shimmered in the late afternoon sun. Why are you doing this, boy?" Elvis slowly took off his baseball cap, holding it in his hands. He looked at Silas, his eyes kind, full of understanding. He knew this moment was coming. "Mr. Silas," Elvis began, his voice soft, resonating with a quiet sincerity. "I saw a store, yes. But I also saw a man who was hurting, a man who was holding on to something precious, even if he didn't realize it." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Mrs. Gable told me about Eleanor and Clara, about the accident. I know what it's like to lose someone you love, to feel like a part of you has gone missing forever. It can make you want to close off, Jesse Guerin. The grief, the emptiness that had never truly gone away. They can be a way to honor the people we've lost by keeping their spirit alive, by letting their dreams flourish." Silas stared at him, his pale blue eyes wide, shimmering. His jaw trembled. All the anger, All the bitterness, all the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself, they seemed to crumble in that moment under the weight of Elvis's profound empathy. The old man who had refused to serve the king, who had been nothing but gruff and withdrawn, now looked utterly vulnerable. I don't understand," Silas mumbled. A single tear tracing a path down one of the deep furrows in his cheek. "Why me? Why would you a stranger?" "'Cause no one should have to carry that kind of weight alone," Elvis said gently. "And because I saw something good in you, Mr. Silas. Something worth fighting for. The man who built this place with his family. The man who loved them so much he couldn't let go, even if he was doing it in a way that hurt him." Silas looked at the store, then back at Elvis, his face a complex mask of grief, gratitude, and utter shock. He didn't say anything more. He just stood there, shoulders shaking slightly as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Tupelo Creek. The refusal, the anger, the disdain, they were gone, replaced by an overwhelming, priceless wave of human connection. The king had not conquered with power, but with a quiet, persistent, and selfless love. Days turned into a week, then two. Silas's Emporium, now gleaming with fresh paint and brighter lights, was a changed place. And so was Silas. Grumpiness hadn't vanished entirely. A lifetime of habit doesn't disappear overnight, but it had softened like hard clay left in the rain. He still grumbled, but now it was often followed by a reluctant smile, a nod, or even a soft word. He talked to customers, actually looking them in the eye. He even started dusting his shelves. Carefully, as if rediscovering old friends, the town, witnessing Silas's transformation, responded in kind. More people came to the store, drawn by the renewed cheerfulness and the sense of shared community. The old Emporium was once again a place of life, a hub. Elvis had stayed watching the blossoming of the store and its owner. He hadn't pushed for further contact with Silas, allowing the old man's space to process the seismic shift in his life. He simply continued his quiet routine, helping a neighbor here, sharing a joke at the diner there. He was still Mr. Thompson, but now he was a beloved part of Tupelo Creek. One crisp morning, Elvis knew it was time to leave. His manager had called. The world was calling. And while he'd found profound peace here, he couldn't disappear forever. He packed his simple bags in the Cadillac and decided to make one last stop. He walked into Silas's Emporium. The bell above the door jingled, but this time it sounded like a welcome, not a mournful sigh. The store was busy for a morning. A few townspeople browsing, the air light with the scent of old wood and fresh possibility. Silas was behind the counter, not hunched over a ledger, but chatting quietly with Mrs. Gable, who was selecting a spool of thread. When he saw Elvis, he paused. Mrs. Gable turned, smiled at Elvis, and then, noticing the unspoken tension, quietly moved away to finish her shopping. Silas slowly walked around the counter, his pale eyes meeting Elvis's. There was no suspicion, no anger, only a profound, heartfelt gratitude that needed no words. He looked at Elvis, really looked at him, and something passed between them, a deep understanding that transcended celebrity and anonymity. "Mr. Thompson," Silas said, his voice surprisingly clear, devoid of its usual gravelly edge. He looked at the renewed store, then back at Elvis. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to, Mr. Silas," Elvis replied gently. "Just keep this place going, keep the memories alive. That's thanks enough." Silas nodded, a small, genuine smile gracing his lips. He looked at the old Coca-Cola cooler in the back, then back at Elvis. "You know," he said, his voice a little shaky, "when you first came in, you asked for a soda, and I told you I didn't have one and that I wouldn't serve your kind." He shook his head, a flicker of remorse in his eyes. "I was wrong about a lot of things." He paused, then took a deep breath, his gaze steady on Elvis. "What can I get for you, son?" he asked, his voice soft, almost tender. Elvis felt a lump form in his throat. This was it, the full circle, the true priceless reaction. Not a demand, but an offer. Not a forced transaction, but a genuine act of connection. "I'd like a cold Coca-Cola," Mr. Silas, Elvis said, his own smile wide and true, "from that old cooler in the back. And," he added, his eyes twinkling, "do you happen to have the local newspaper today?" Silas chuckled, a real, full-bodied chuckle that filled the store. "I reckon I do," he said. He walked to the cooler, pulled out a bottle, and popped the cap with a practiced ease. Then he retrieved a fresh copy of the Tupelo Creek Gazette from a stack on the counter. As their fingers brushed, Silas's gaze lingered on Elvis's face. He saw something beyond the fedora and the quiet demeanor, a charisma, a presence, a kindness that was undeniable. A glint of recognition, a flicker of understanding crossed his eyes. He might not have known the name, but he knew he was in the presence of someone extraordinary. "You know, son," Silas said, his voice low, "you're a good man, a real good man." He paused, a wry smile playing on his lips. You're a king, son, a real king." He left it at that, a quiet acknowledgement that didn't need explanation. Elvis smiled, his heart full. Paid for the soda, and the newspaper, the simple transaction infused with years of silent struggle and weeks of quiet transformation. He walked out of the store, the cold bottle in his hand, the newspaper tucked under his arm. The bell above the door chimed a happy, resonant sound. He walked to his Cadillac, got in, and started the engine. He looked at the rejuvenated Silas's Emporium one last time. It stood there, a beacon of second chances, a testament to the power of quiet kindness. He had come to Tupelo Creek seeking anonymity, a moment of peace. He had found something far more precious, a true connection, a chance to help heal a broken heart, and a profound reminder that the most valuable thing he possessed wasn't his fame, but his humanity. As he drove away, leaving Tupelo Creek and its transformed general store behind, Elvis took a long, satisfying sip of his cold Coca-Cola. It was the best soda he'd ever tasted, and the grumpiest store owner had taught him a priceless lesson.